Good afternoon, everybody. We are live for our Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do, again, if anybody is hopping on live, anything like that during these Q&A sessions, you're welcome to ask questions, anything that pertains to material in the program that we go through, anything relating to just any type of struggles that you're having implementing the material, or any questions that have come up. So really the purpose of these Q&As is not necessarily to give you more training, so to speak, even though I will give you a CMH certificate for however long this live Q&A lasts. But really the goal is more to give you additional clarity on the trainings that I've already put out there for you and answer any questions that have come up as people are implementing the strategies. So one housekeeping thing about the CMHs before we get going, these Q&As last anywhere from, they've been as short as 30 minutes, they've gone as long as 90 minutes. I usually block out about an hour or so with a little wiggle room. So really my goal is to be here as long as you need me to be here. And no more, because I know that those of you watching after the fact, you don't want to watch longer than you need to. So with the CMHs, because I don't always know how long the sessions are going to go, I will post those certificates after the fact in the files in this Facebook group. And so how that works is that it's CMHs, just like the all of the trainings. So you can print out that certificate and keep it for your records. It is, again, not the same thing as CEUs. It's just a different type of hours. ASHA does accept it. States vary with regards to what types of hours they accept. So obviously you want to be familiar with any types of requirements for licenses you have, because you're responsible for knowing what you need to do. But CMHs will work for ASHA. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So I wanted to take some time to address, there's really two questions that came in this month that were the most pressing. And the reason that I'm picking these questions is that not just because people specifically reached out to me and asked them this month, but also because they are questions that have come up many times throughout the course of the program. So first question being, what types of screenings are good to use? That one's kind of a quick one, so I'm going to address that one first. And then the next one is kind of a bigger question that a lot of you have been asking in the group and via email and whatever. But that is really about, so when we are working with kids with language disorders, a lot of times those kids are struggling with things like reading comprehension and writing. But in Language Therapy Advanced, the things that I'm actually having you do, a lot of the strategies aren't directly working on those things yet. And there is a reason for that. I will get into that more deeply in a minute. But really the question is, okay, we've got these structured things. How do we work towards working on things like reading comprehension and writing? And how does that look? When should we be doing that? And really just giving you some certainty and clarity around implementing the techniques in the program, trusting the process, but also just really also making sure that you're actually doing what you need to be doing for your kids. So let's talk about the screenings first, because that one's a quicker answer. So I do get questions a lot of the time about, like, I got a referral. How do I know when I should evaluate? How do I know if we should do RTI or whatever? How do I use that? How do I identify if there is a language issue? So I will tell you that because a screening is not diagnostic, all that it is designed to do is identify a red flag, which basically means, hey, over here, something might be wrong. You need to look into this further. It doesn't tell you whether or not a disorder is present. So because of that, the procedures and the tools are not as in-depth as an evaluation tool, because they are not designed to go in depth. They're just designed to help us identify who might need some additional attention. So the things that I'm going to recommend are obviously there are a variety of formal and informal measures that you can do. So number one, with screening procedures, one thing to keep in mind in the schools is that you don't necessarily need to be physically the one doing the screening in order to determine if you need to do an eval. You need data and you need some information, but you don't physically need to be that person that collects that information. There's other data available to you if you are working with a student in the school systems that can help you to identify if an evaluation is necessary, that don't necessarily require you to physically pull a kid out and ask them a bunch of questions. I will give you some tools for actually doing that in a minute, because sometimes you do need that for some additional information, but you have other things available to you. So for example, classroom assessments, measures of writing. You can look at writing samples. You can look at reading comprehension scores. You can look at the district-wide screenings in reading comprehension and fluency. And what that does is that because you, as the SLP, are supposed to be helping kids perform in school, all of those things that I've just mentioned, language can impact those. So if there is an issue with language, it might come out on some of those things. And so really, you can actually use that to determine if you should go ahead with an evaluation. Another thing is that when I was in the school systems, I would often go to the reading teachers because they would do a lot of in-depth assessments with all of the students to determine which students would go into Title I and some other services that they offered. So they had some really in-depth assessments where they would see how well kids were decoding, how well they were writing. And so a lot of times I would go and sit in and observe a reading session with the students and have a conversation with the reading teacher, and I would have a pretty good idea of whether or not I needed to go ahead and do an evaluation. Because a lot of times they'll do standardized tests that will have a measure of vocabulary and grammar and things like that. It's obviously not as in-depth as what we would do as SLPs, but it is good as a screener to be able to tell, whether or not there's an issue. And I know the relationship I had with the reading teachers is that I had a couple of them that really were on top of that. And a lot of times they would refer to me and I would say, you know what, I think we're okay. I would say that more often than not, they would refer a lot more than they would under refer for language issues. But I'd rather have that situation. I'd rather know about it and check in on a kid than have them not referring to me at all. So they gave me a lot of information. So you've got a ton of tools at your fingertips. One other thing I wanted to mention is that sometimes the psychologist, like they would initiate a full case study evaluation, and speech and language wouldn't come up as an issue. Now, also in my district, I had the kind of relationship where the psychologist would usually be having that conversation with me before they even initiated the evaluation. But there were times where we thought, you know what, like for whatever reason, they didn't talk to me beforehand, or we really didn't think language was an issue when we initiated the evaluation. But the psychologist does their evaluation, and they have also some composites and scores that were also related to language. Again, same thing as the reading teachers. They had some subtests that looked like language, or that dove into aspects of language like vocabulary, but not as in-depth as we were. So a lot of times what would happen is a psychologist would come to me and say, you know what, this student, we didn't think language was an issue, but they scored low on this test. Do you think that you need to do an evaluation? And then I would often use that, just solely the psychologist assessment, knowing that all of those other people do not dive as deeply into language as I would, but they give information about red flags. Thank you for your comments, Paige. So Paige just said, I appreciate your comments on dealing with assholes at work. Yes, so I'm sharing a lot here about having good relationships with people at work. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and there's always that person. So I'm glad that it was helpful for some people, because I definitely got some hate about throwing that out there. But I do it for the people who appreciate it. All right, so we've covered screening tools, what you can use for screeners. All right, so let's talk about some things that you can actually do. Somebody refers to you, you feel like you need a screener. My go-to is the self-screener. So again, it's not perfect. You also want to see if you can gather any of that other information that I just mentioned, but that is a good tool for just indicating whether or not you should go ahead with an evaluation. The self also has some checklists that come with it that are good to give teachers, that can also be used as a screening tool. If you've got a bunch of different things on those scales that come out, like the teacher is mentioning the kid has a hard time listening, following directions, that can also be used as a screener. And what I've also done in the past is sometimes I might pick a subtest from a formal evaluation and use that as a screener as well, and then just not give the full test. So you can do that. There's a number of subtests on things like the self, the told, that you can use as a screening tool, assuming that you have consent. A couple other things that are informal that you can use that I know people have used for things like data collection, that come from actually measures that have been created by SLPs. I'm going to share links to these, but there's a couple on Teachers Pay Teachers. And again, a lot of these are things that, again, you want to keep in mind that they're screeners, and you might not necessarily be working on all these things in therapy. A lot of the things in these screeners are things that, some of them might be higher level things that where I might say, you know what, you need to work on vocabulary and syntax first, but they're good for screeners because they're functional language skills. It gives you an idea of whether or not something is an issue. So those two screeners that are pretty thorough, there is one from Natalie Snyder's. These are both Teachers Pay Teachers, and the other one is from Nicole Allison. Let me see if I just pulled these up really quickly. There's Natalie Snyder's, the one that I just shared. No, wait, that was Nicole Allison that I just shared. Here's Natalie's. Here's a blog post. So those are pretty good. They're pretty solid for screening toolkits if you want some kind of a screener, or even something. I know some of them were made to be progress monitoring tools as well. So those are some pretty good resources. Let me just look. Self 5 screener. Share the Self 5 screener as well, although you probably are all familiar with that one. So these are some good ones. All right, so that covers screening. Let's move on to talk about the bigger question, which is, so how do I deal with the strategies that we're working on in Language Therapy Advance when we are wanting to work on things like, the two things I'm going to pull out would be things like reading comprehension and written language. So those things are kind of the big cohesion things. Like when you're comprehending something that you're reading, like a bunch of paragraphs or maybe an entire chapter, you've got to put all of that information together. So vocabulary, or semantic knowledge, syntactic knowledge, morphological knowledge, you're putting it all together and making sense of it at once. And then also figuring out not just what those individual words and sentences mean, but also just the big picture and getting the gist of it. So that's a high level cohesion thing. Same thing with writing. What you're doing is taking the skills that you have from those things that I just mentioned and putting them into sentences and making them all flow together with all of your ideas. So again, high level cohesion. But the problem that happens a lot of times for kids with language disorders is that they'll be struggling with those things. They'll be struggling with writing. They'll be struggling with reading and reading comprehension. And what will happen is that you'll get a referral, and the teacher will say they're struggling with this, they don't understand questions, and whatever, their writing is a hot mess, they're all over, their ideas don't make sense, they've got grammatical errors all over the place. And so what we do a lot of times is that we work on those skills that the teacher mentions that are coming out in the curriculum. And a lot of times, by the time they get to us, they might have gotten some type of response intervention. So when I was working with students in late elementary school, 4th through 6th grade, a lot of times the RTI would be focused on reading comprehension. So they'd be in some kind of a group, they're doing discussions and all of those different things. And so all that's great. You should absolutely be able to read a book and explain what happened, but then our students aren't. So we're working on that exact skill that they're struggling with. But that is basically what you're doing a lot of the times when you're working on something like that, is treating a symptom of the problem, not the problem itself. Because what happens is that if we do not have vocabulary knowledge, if we do not have knowledge of what an individual word means, so that semantic knowledge, if we do not have the morphological and phonological knowledge to be able to decode a word, and obviously morphology and phonology both play a factor in actually reading the word and making sense of it. If we do not, if syntax doesn't make sense to us and we don't know the function of words and the way that the sentence is structured doesn't make sense to us, what happens is we don't understand enough of the individual words, and then we can't understand words and sentences. So if you can't do that, and if you don't have comprehension at that sentence level, what happens is, of course, you can't make sense of the big picture in the entire paragraph. And so maybe you understand some of the sentences and some of the words, but what happens is that you use so many of your cognitive resources trying to figure that out, trying to decode, trying to figure out, like thinking about what the word means or making sense of the sentences, that there is a comprehension breakdown. And so what happens is that when we go right to working on comprehension, because we've skipped all those other things, it's almost like you're taking somebody who doesn't know how to swim and throwing them into the deep end and being like, okay, swim to the edge. And then they're drowning, and then you have to go help them along and get them to the edge. And then you're like, okay, let's try it again. Throw them back in again. And then they still don't know what to do. Instead of maybe teaching them what to do with their arms and teaching them what to do with their legs and teaching them how to position their body and things like that. So we're basically asking them to do something over and over again that they're not able to do without showing them how to do it. So that's why, and the thing is that a lot of times in the school systems, teachers are working on comprehension. And that's fine for a lot of kids because they can figure out all those other things that we work on in here implicitly. And teachers do some things directly, but often not to the extent that our students need. Our students with language disorders or other disabilities that impact language just need more and more intensity. So a lot of times, all these things that we're dealing with in language therapy advanced, nobody's really doing them to the extent that our students need. So that's why we focus so intently on them. So when the question comes up of how do I work on reading comprehension and writing, well, if you're working on these things, you actually are working on reading comprehension and writing, because all of these things are going to have an impact on that. So that's number one. So that means if you have a goal for writing or reading comprehension, you can be working on that goal without always working on that goal. Now, obviously, if you find over time that they really do have a lot of issues with syntax and vocabulary, and you're spending so much time on that you never get to the reading comprehension goal or the writing goal, then maybe you do need to back up and revise those goals when their IEP comes due. But what I often would do if I knew that, I thought we'd be able to, within the scope of that IEP, eventually cycle around to things, those higher level cohesion things like reading comprehension or writing an entire paragraph or essay, what I would do is that first, I would be focusing on those foundational things that we do in here, like individual sentences and things like that. And then what I would do is when we would go to collect the data, I would report on that goal, even if I wasn't the one collecting the data, because a lot of times with IEP goals, you don't necessarily have to be the one collecting the data for that goal to be able to report on it, because you might have data from the classroom teachers. A special ed teacher might also be co-implementing that goal, and you're still both working on it. You're just doing it in a different way. I would do this a lot with special ed teachers if they had a goal. I did this a lot with writing, because a lot of times I would end up really hitting that's the syntax, and then the special ed teacher would be working on writing paragraphs. So we'd both be working on writing, and there would be goals for both, but I would be the one reporting on the sentence level things, and the special ed teacher would be working that in. And occasionally I would be working at what she was doing in as well, but we were hitting it from two different angles. And because of that, because I knew that somebody else was dealing with this, I could rest assured that I wasn't missing anything for my students. So that's number one. That is where you can start with it, is focusing on those foundational things and knowing that, like, if you have another way to track that, and you know that they're working on it somewhere, you're still working towards that goal, even if you're not the one that's actually asking them to do the task. Chances are, if you've got a student who is in elementary school, they're probably doing some reading comprehension activity somewhere. So if they are, then you're just hitting it from another angle, and you're kind of like a puzzle piece fitting in here, supporting them in that. So that's number one. Having said that, students do eventually need to actually take those things that you've taught them and get help applying them. So it's kind of like, you know, I always give kids, like when I would do articulation therapy, I would tell my students why we would have to work on things in stages. And so I would say something like, okay, you just made an R for me. You just sat there and you made an R, but you're not doing it when you have a conversation. It's kind of like sitting there and practicing your layups when nobody is trying to take the ball from you in basketball versus actually trying to make a layup in a game. It's totally different. So we do eventually need to work towards taking some of these skills that we work on in the more structured setting and then working them into some of that high level comprehension work in therapy. The reason that I focus so much on the word study techniques is that, number one, a lot of us weren't really given a framework for doing it in grad school in the depth that our students need it. And a lot of us know how to do reading comprehension work. We know how to sit there and probe our students with questions when we're getting them to summarize the main idea and things like that. And a lot of times we're already doing that, and we don't need more of the same. A lot of times SLPs are doing a lot of, quote, literacy-based therapy, and it's like, oh, you're supposed to be doing, using books in therapy, and, this is good and everything. And obviously it is. You should totally use books in therapy and reading passages. But the problem with that is if you do go to that without really understanding the stuff that we're doing in Language Therapy Advanced, you're just doing a bunch of random stuff. Like, you're not really hitting those specific skills within the context of using that book. You're just kind of asking them random questions and jumping around, and you're not necessarily giving them enough specific trials and practices, and you're not necessarily controlling the amount of practice they get with specific skills to the extent that you should be. So it's not that I know a lot of times people will listen to my stuff and think like, oh, she doesn't want you to do that. No, that's not the case. It's just that a lot of times what happens is that when people understand this, they figure out how to work it into reading comprehension because they already are doing that. They just aren't working these other skills in. So having said that, what you want to do ideally, just the sequence as far as the way to actually work up to things like reading and writing, is that you can do it in kind of in cycles, almost like the cycles approach for phonological awareness, or not phonological awareness, phonological disorders, speech sound disorders. So you're going to cycle through all of those different things that we do in the program, like semantic feature analysis, studying definition syntax, studying complex sentences and compound sentences, studying morphology. You're going to cycle through all that stuff a couple times. There's not a, like, you have to do it for this many minutes kind of thing like there is with the cycles approach. But I would say that you want to at least do it enough that your students are familiar with the activity. And then when you move on to the next thing, whether it be you're going from semantic feature analysis to syntax, you want to try to work some of that stuff in and remind them, maybe do like a quick description of a word with semantic feature analysis, just take a couple minutes and model it or something like that. Work in some kind of reminders and modeling in the subsequent stages, just so that they're not forgetting about it. But don't worry if you do one thing and then you go on to another thing for a while. And don't worry if you, for example, took some time studying a specific word using semantic feature analysis and your students can't rattle it off exactly and they don't exactly remember what that word means. You want to focus more on them understanding the process and the steps of looking at language. So do they actually remember how to do semantic feature analysis? Do they actually remember the format of a definition? Not necessarily, do they know the meaning of the word? Do they understand the process? Because if they can understand that process, then they're going to be able to apply that to learning other words. So yes, obviously we're pulling in tier 2 vocabulary and we want to be directly explaining words, but we're more focused on the process and helping them become more meta and being more aware of that during the process. So all we're doing is cycling through all those different things. So that is the order that I tend to go in, is the semantic feature analysis to definition syntax, to syntax and complex sentences, to morphological study, and then we cycle back around. And I talk about this in the study or the training on morphology, phonology, and orthography. I show you how to cycle through all of it. So once you get through that a couple times, and this could be over the course of a couple months, what you're going to want to do, usually you'll be about at the end of a quarter. So what you're going to want to do is then start working in some days where you're working on reading comprehension. And eventually how that might look is that what you're doing during the session is you might take a couple minutes at the beginning to maybe do some of those word study techniques that I've mentioned before, like semantic feature analysis or looking at the morphemes in a word. Take a couple of minutes to review that process, and then you're going to pick out some key words in that reading passage. You're going to read the passage, and while you're reading that passage, you're going to be mindful of a couple things. So you're going to be paying attention to ways that you could help students use context clues. You're going to be thinking of ways that you could maybe pull out a sentence that has a complex sentence structure that you could point out to your students after the fact. And you're going to also be thinking of ways that you could extend that discussion into maybe a discussion of semantic feature analysis or that word's definition. And so you're just going to read that passage and have your students retell it or answer questions about it to make sure that they're comprehending. And then in addition to that, you're going to pick out those words or sentences and just take a couple of minutes and study them like you would when you're doing those more structured activities. And you're just going to start working that in. And so that's how eventually over time your sessions are going to really evolve. Same thing, actually, let me back up because I want to talk about writing in a minute. So this could look a number of different ways. You might cycle through all the different techniques and then do a reading comprehension session where you're pulling some of those techniques in, and you might do that for a couple weeks, and then you might cycle back through it again. So start with the structured things like semantic feature analysis and basically use that reading comprehension activity as one of those different activities in the cycle so that you're working on all those things, but then you're pulling them in. And the reason we don't just go to reading comprehension, even though it's the ultimate goal, is that research has shown that a lot of students aren't even ready to start benefiting from reading comprehension. So a lot of times the reason that students are not benefiting from it and they're not making progress is because if we do not address those underlying issues with syntax and semantics and just all of those measures of vocabulary, then those issues with reading comprehension will persist. So that's why for some kids, you have this group of kids that is responding really well to classroom instruction and reading comprehension instruction. And so that's why there's a lot of research, or there's a lot of people doing it, because it works for a lot of kids that don't have those underlying language issues. But for the kids that do, they're stuck here because they don't have that foundation. So you need to give them that before they're even ready to start working on those comprehension pieces. And it's okay if you're working, like somebody else is working on reading comprehension and you're working on these other things like we're doing in Language Therapy Advanced. But it is a good idea to really get familiar with the activities yourself and then start having those conversations with the teachers that you're working with, so that you can figure out ways where they can start working it into what they're doing as well, because that is like the utopia of what we really want, is for our services to go beyond our therapy room. So really that is how it would look if you're cycling through all of that. What we want to do with the screening issue and with the whole, like, am I really working on reading comprehension if I'm not technically working on it? So really what we want to think about is just being flexible about what we consider services to be. So having a conversation with the teacher and showing them how to do something is providing a service, even though you're not directly teaching or you're not directly the one doing the therapy. Looking at something or reviewing a student's work is doing a service for the student. I know, unfortunately, that a lot of our administrators don't feel this way, but what this does is that realistically that a lot of those students on your caseload need you more than the 30 to 40 minutes a week that you have them. So we've got to think about ways that we can take that 30 to 40 minutes and make the most of it, and then also figure out how to spread it out so that they're actually getting some of those things outside of our therapy room. So that's really how we would do it. I wanted to take a couple minutes and talk about writing as well, because that can also be an additional phase in the cycle that I just mentioned. It could be in place of the reading comprehension, or it can be another one in addition to. And so this would be things like writing full paragraphs, writing, using a graphic organizer. And the reason that this is so challenging is because a lot of times a teacher how they will teach writing is that it's like they'll spend Monday talking about, like they'll be lecturing or presenting some information to their students and modeling the way that they're going to be planning and writing. And then the students will start to work on it. And then it's a process that takes the entire week, sometimes a couple weeks. And we don't have that 45-minute language arts period every day to do that. We just maybe have 40 minutes. So it can be really hard to do paragraph level writing. One way that you can get around it is to go into the classroom during that language arts period, or to take a draft that your student has already written and try to fine tune it with them. What you actually can do, if you are able to actually have time to work through the writing process with your students, is you want to think about, again, a couple things and a couple different ways that you can work in all of that work on vocabulary and figure out how to get them to apply it in their writing. So with the reading comprehension, you're looking for those difficult words, you're looking for those sentences, and you're going to read through, answer questions, and then pull them out and do some word study over here with them. With writing, it's different because they are producing it. And what you're likely going to see for a student with a language disorder is that the writing is going to be either very disorganized, it's going to have some grammatical errors in it. A lot of times the vocabulary is very vague, and so they might use a lot of words like things and stuff, or maybe they're using words that are appropriate, but they're just not very robust. And so what you can do is really use the process that we would use if we're actually writing. This is the problem with writing instruction today and with just the way that it's often done, is that the people that are teaching writing, they're teaching, you know, 4th, 5th grade level writing or whatever, but a lot of times it's been a while they've been in the shoes of actually having to write something challenging for them. So think about how it is for you. How long has it been since you actually had to write a paper that was at a level that was challenging for you, like what you're asking your students to do? Probably you haven't done it in a while, unless you are, you know, like I was doing it when I was getting my doctorate because I had to for class. But if you're not in school right now, a lot of times you aren't writing papers anymore. I mean, obviously teachers are, a lot of them are going back for their master's or doctorate or graduate certificates or whatever. And so they are doing it. But a lot of times we forget the process that we went through ourselves, and we forget how to get that out to our students. And so we want to have the same process that we would do on our own. And so what we typically would do when we're writing is that we would do it in phases. So number one, you have the research and planning. So if you're telling a narrative, a lot of times you go right to the planning. You're just thinking about your story. You might think about your characters and the story you want to tell. But if you're doing some type of nonfiction writing, there is some research that you have to pull together. You've got to take notes first. So that's the first step. And then you've got the planning and the organization of your paper. A lot of times what happens is that we will start the revision and editing stage of writing before we actually get to the point that the meat and the overall skeleton of the paper is there. So what you're going to want to do when you have a student with a language disorder, or really any student for that matter, is that you want to make sure that the overall structure is there, even if it's kind of rough, even if maybe the sentences don't make sense. You want to make sure that the structure is actually there, and then you can go in and do a couple things. Number one, you can look at the way that they've worded things, and number one, fix the grammatical errors. And number two, you can show them ways to base, if you've done syntax study and they've got a lot of really simple sentences, what you can do is pull out ways that they've said something, and you can coach them through turning it into a complex sentence, or using some type of syntax that's a little bit more robust. Same thing with vocabulary. If they're using the same words over and over again, what you can do is take that word and coach them through actually using some vocabulary that is more difficult, because then they're actually applying those words that you've shown them before. And if you've done semantic feature analysis, you know, maybe you can do, you know, pull out some words that maybe might be relevant there that they could use in their paper. Another thing that you can do if maybe you haven't studied a word specifically is that you take the word that they used, you go on the internet and look up that word, and then that gives you it'll usually give you a definition of the word. So there's a chance to reinforce the syntax of definitions, but you can also look within that definition and in the thesaurus for other words that would fit within that paragraph. So that is a way that you can do it, and you can start to work it in. But the thing is that when we write, when anybody writes, and this is a term that's often used by even like the famous writers out there and people who have tons of published things. They make what they refer to as the shitty first draft, and so basically we need to allow our students to have a shitty first draft. So let them get that out. You want there to be some structure there, but let there be some errors there at first. And then what you're going to do, once you have the outline there and the structure of it, then you're going to go in and you're going to make fine tune those things like transitions, making the syntax more robust, making the vocabulary more robust, and then you're going to smooth it out. So that's how you want to do it. So that's really how we can work this in to work on writing. The challenge with this is that it doesn't a lot of times work with the way that our speech therapy schedule works in the schools, but it is possible. You can sometimes even do, you could, in theory, if you've planned ahead of time and taken good notes with your student, you could do some type of a short essay or something like that within one session if you really planned ahead for it. So that's a way that you can help them apply it. So those are some ideas for you as far as how you can actually start working this in. I would say, again, think of it as a cycle that you're working through, knowing that a lot of times with language disorders, it's like, it's not a quick fix thing. It's something that we're going to have to keep working on with these students. A lot of times, if you really hit it hard in the early years, I've had some students who we thought for sure they're going to need lots of services, and they were able to get out of special education by late elementary school or junior high. Doesn't mean that they were straight A students, but they were able to function pretty well in school. I've had kind of a mix of students. I've had some kids who I had one student who was technically, I still could have made a case for continuing to qualify him for services when he was in 4th grade, but he had learned such good compensatory strategies and he was such a good advocate for himself that I felt that it would be better for him to be in the classroom being pushed by the teacher rather than being pulled out with me. So, his teachers knew what we had been working on, so they were able to reinforce it. So I actually recommended for him, even though some of the scores were still below, the actual level of functioning had improved. So sometimes that happens as well, where you might have a kid where they do have a couple scores that are lower, but their level of functioning in the classroom is, they're able to get by and do pretty well. Now there's other kids who they do get to the point where their language scores are within the average range for those kids who are, and I'm talking about those kids who are, mild speech and language impairment. Of course, there are a lot of students who don't get to that point where they're out of special ed, but what we really want them to do is to be more independent and to be able to do more on their own, because ultimately get them to their least restrictive environment. And I have had students like that as well, where they may have started out in the early years with the one-on-one aid, with most of their core classes in the special ed room. And when we were able to get those language skills to a higher level, they still needed the support, but they were at least able to be in the classroom with more of a co-taught situation, or maybe just get a couple classes pulled out as opposed to being in a special ed room all day. So really our goal with our students is not to wave a magic wand and make the language issues disappear. A lot of times it's not possible. What we want them to do is get whatever that level is. We want to figure out what's that next level of independence beyond there and get them to that next level, and then keep working up as high as we can possibly go. All right, let me look at my notes here to make sure I've addressed all of the questions. Those were the big ones. Again, how do we deal with the high level comprehension things? How do we deal with screening procedures? Again, if you've got any questions now that are coming up for you, feel free to pop them in the chat. I can always answer them on the spot here. That's of course what these live Q&As are for. There's like a 45-second delay from Facebook Live for the time that I am talking to the time that I see you. So there's been a couple times where I've said, oh, there's no questions, we're good. And then I see a question in the comments after I sign off. So that actually happened last time. And I think one of the questions that one person had asked was about selection of vocabulary. So I do have a program that dives just into selection of vocabulary and how to assess vocabulary. It's kind of I wouldn't say a prerequisite to language therapy advance, because you could technically, I mean, you can implement and get pretty far with just language therapy advance, but it gives you kind of I would say it's an introductory level to some of the foundational things that you might need to know before starting. So, for example, how do you pick the words that you're going to study when you do these techniques? That program is called the Vocabulary Foundation. You can email me if you're interested in that. But what I talk about in that program is how to pick target vocabulary. And so the philosophy that we want to have with that is, I'll give you kind of the quick and dirty version right here, is that yes, we want to use tier 2 vocabulary when we're selecting words. That's our starting point, because again, the tiers of vocabulary is, tier 1, conversational words, not super difficult for most students. Things like, pen or cup, or things that you would hear in conversation that most people could just pick up on their own. Tier 2 would be those difficult words that are academic, that also happen across academic contexts. So that would be things like comprehend or analyze, those kind of words. Summarize is another one. So those words are very useful because they're difficult, which means that kids need you to teach them directly, because they're difficult, kids don't pick up on them on their own. They don't necessarily happen in conversational speech. They happen more in text language and academic settings. So they happen a lot across academic settings, but not necessarily in conversation. So not to the extent that kids figure them out. So they do need some direct instruction from us, because they're difficult and they're a high priority because they happen across all academic contexts. And then there are obviously the tier 3 words, which are the academic words that only happen in specific content areas. So like specific science vocabulary, social studies vocabulary, things like one science word for the late elementary school was cnidarian. It's like a little invertebrate with spiny tentacles. I didn't even know what it was before I looked at the 4th grade science book. Maybe I knew at one point when I was in 4th grade, but I forgot it. Clearly it wasn't that useful to me except for the test. So, and then that's the point, is that a lot of times those words that are tier 3, our students do struggle with them, but as far as the context of their lives, it's not as important for them to know those things. It's kind of like, and I know we don't talk a lot about AAC in here, but one of the teachers I was working with was programming in the state capitals into her student's AAC device, but the student didn't even know how to ask to go to the bathroom. And I'm like, maybe you should work on her asking you and telling you when she has to pee before you worry about telling what the state capital of whatever is. Like, think functional, what's going to be useful for students. So that's really, and again, I know it's different for AAC, but when we're thinking about academic vocabulary, we do start with tier 2. So the thing is about the tiers of vocabulary framework, though, is that it was designed for teachers that have a 40-minute or whatever language arts period every day. It was not designed for SLPs who have a much shorter time frame. So does the framework apply to what we do? Absolutely. But do we need to add an additional strategic element in choosing that vocabulary? Absolutely, because we have to prioritize what's already been prioritized. And there's a couple other things. So number one, we can't get to all of the tier 2 words. So we've got to pick the tier 2 words from the list that would be even more relevant to our students. And sometimes we might need to spend time on some tier 1 words because sometimes our students don't even know those. So we might have to work those in as well. And those would be things like temporal or spatial concepts that a lot of times students need to know to be able to follow directions, and they just don't know. So you might be working those in as well. And then periodically, like, there's nothing wrong with working tier 3 vocabulary in, as long as it's not like you're sitting there drilling the words. If it's just like, it's relevant to pull them in based on the reading passage that you have or the student's interest, or if they're related to the tier 2 words that you're working on, then you can certainly, you don't have to be like, oh, we don't talk about these because they're tier 3. But what you want to think about is that you get those words, you get a repertoire of words from, whether it be a specific word list that you have, or word lists that you get from teachers from their reading curriculum. A lot of times reading curriculums will have tier 2 words. So you get those words and you want to think about it not as in my students have to know these words. What you want to think about is these are words that we're playing around with, and I'm giving my students exposure to these words, and these are the words that I'm going to pull in while I'm teaching the students the process. So think of them as probes that you can play around with. Yes, we would hope within the context of doing semantic feature study, definition syntax, that they would also be learning what those words mean. But if they don't exactly remember it, that's okay, because again, we're focused more on the process. So think of them as words to use to practice the process. And so that way, yes, do you absolutely want to check and see if your students remember what those words mean? Absolutely. But don't worry if they don't know them and they can't rattle off a perfect definition. You'd want to see if they can go back to the process and at least, figure out, like, for example, if you ask a student what a word means and they don't know what it means, but if you can pull out the syntax template that you have for giving them a definition, and they can start to give you some of that information that goes in that syntactic structure, that's good. Even if they say something really vague, like it's a kind of stuff that does this, or it's a kind of thing that does this, reward the fact that they at least gave you the right format, even though they gave you a word that wasn't exactly right. You can go back to what they said and show them how to plug in a more specific word. So that's how, when you're actually choosing vocabulary, how you want to think of it. Don't feel like, oh my gosh, I need to go back and, put my little plus marks next to these vocabulary words. The challenge with that is that I know that you get pressure from your administrators, but what the actual data that you're collecting should measure is how well your students can actually do the process. So rather than, did the student get this definition perfectly right? Is it, the progress you'd want to measure would be something more like, how many different descriptive attributes did they give about this word? And were they right? And if they're able to do more of that than they were before, then that's how you can measure progress. Were they able to name more semantic features? Were they able to, use the word in a sentence appropriately, or at least more appropriately than they were able to do before? So that's how you can measure progress rather than some of those more rigid things. And because the thing is that, a lot of times, and I do give word lists out to people, in the Vocabulary Foundation course, I do give you words that, I say these are kindergarten words, these are first grade words. When what I mean by that is that they're pulled from kindergarten and first grade curriculums. It doesn't mean like this is a rigid standard that you have to follow and, worry that they don't know all of these words if they're in kindergarten, or worry that, or feel like you can't pull in some words from third grade when you're working with second graders, or pull some words from the first grade list to a student in third grade, because even if it's relevant and even if it happens to be on that first grade list, think of it more as like a starting point and a reference point rather than this is the way that it has to be. Because a lot of times with language growth, there's not a lot of guidelines out there. We have a lot of good charts out there for developmental milestones for birth through 6, but then beyond that, K through 12, there's not a lot of milestones out there. And the reason is because language growth varies so much based on environment. So obviously, if kids are exposed to things in kindergarten, and what words tend to be exposed to students in a kindergarten curriculum, then that is a good benchmark for what kids are likely to know simply because they've been exposed to it. But obviously that's going to vary based on geographic region and things like that, and how much the kids are reading at home. So that's why, that's why there's not a lot of good milestone charts out there for language milestones, and like, this is what needs to be done at this age and things like that, because it does vary so much on their environment. The only thing, one of the skills that does tend to have more of a linear growth pattern is our students' ability to use complex sentences and subordination. So if you don't know what subordination is, that's when you are using a complex sentence, because the conjunction that combines it. So for example, the word because, like, we went to sleep because we were tired. Adding that clause on, because we were tired, that's a subordinate clause. Being able to do that, that is the one thing that does tend to have that linear growth pattern, where it gradually increases over the course of K-12 during those age groups. But a lot of the other things, like, you know, how many words they know, yes, there are some standards out there, but it's not a thing where you're going to be like seeing this nice, neat growth pattern over the years. And that's why with language scores and with things like, I'm typing in something right now that I can share with you guys just to give you kind of a reference point here. But that's why some of these things that we have to do in the schools, or really just for insurance companies, if you're in the medical setting or in private practice and billing insurance and things like that, a lot of times they are just not necessarily the best as far as asking us to do something that's actually meaningful. So we do have to collect data, but and we want to make sure that we're staying accountable, but at the same time, there's not always a rigid way that it's like, you know, we came back to this and the kid hasn't made this neat upward pattern. A lot of times that's just how language works. It's not linear. So, but we do want, and when we focus on specific processes and strategies, like a lot of the meta strategies and the word study strategies that we do in Language Therapy Advanced, if you focus more on your student's ability to apply the strategy, that does give you more of a measure of something that you can say, you know, they're making measurable progress. I wanted to share something with you really quickly, just from the blog. You know, again, just some things. I've mentioned syntax here, just an article, and I know a lot of you have seen this. You know what, I'm going to share, I'm going to share the article that Paige mentioned earlier. She said she appreciated this one. Again, don't be reading this with your small children who can reading over your shoulder, because there's some adult language in this one. And then, so that's the one that I know we've talked a lot about collaborating with your colleagues today. I talked about that at the beginning with the screening procedures, but here in this post that I'm also going to share, this is the post about expanding sentences. So these are all things that are covered in Language Therapy Advanced. But what we do here is really just, it's just kind of a synopsis of what I've talked about today about, you know, how important it is to build that syntactic and a semantic foundation for students. So there is that for you. All right. I am going to just pause for a minute here, give you guys all a chance to process that. Feel free to post a question in the chat. Feel free to, after this, if something comes up that you think of, feel free to post a question as well after the fact in a thread. What I do is, when I hop on these Q&As, is that I usually go through the comments and questions that have been coming up in the group, and I look for patterns, and or if people have emailed me and things like that, is I look at some of the most common questions that are coming up, and then that's what I cover in these Q&As. But again, the Q&As aren't necessarily just meant for me to just talk the whole time. There's room for dialogue as well. So when you guys hop on here, if you've got a question, feel free to interrupt me, or not interrupt me, but just throw it in the comments. And whenever I finish talking about whatever question I'm answering, I'll be sure to answer your question live as well. Because the goal of this is to give you that additional support, because really the bottom line is that professional development, when you go to a conference, it's great. And it's fun to get away for a couple days and go to ASHA or whatever your state conference is. But there's not a lot of research that shows that just the one and done professional development actually works, because it doesn't have that ongoing support and mentoring. So there's a lot more evidence to support professional development in a community, which we have here, and also when there is some ongoing dialogue and mentoring to help people with the actual implementation. So that's exactly why we do these Q&As. So with all that being said, I hope you enjoy those resources that I have shared with you. Feel free to keep the questions coming, and I will be posting what you can do once you watch this hour. I'm going to be posting the CMH certificate in the files, so you can print that for your records and use this for hours, for contact hours. Again, it's CMHs, not CEUs. That's different, because those are the kind that you have to track on your own, because they're coming from somebody who is not directly affiliated with ASHA. All right. And again, obviously you want to make sure of what type of hours your state licensing board requires, because they are all different as far as whether or not they want CEUs, CMHs, or other types of hours. So just be aware of that, and know that you're responsible for knowing what types of hours are required for all of the licensing, or all the licenses you have. All right. So I don't see any other questions popping in the chat at this time. So I am going to wrap it up, but feel free to add any comments. And thank you so much for everybody who chimed in and listened tonight, and for those of you who made comments. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And for those of you who are watching this after the fact, and you'll be able to download your CMH certificate in the files afterwards once you watch the whole thing. All right, everybody, have a good evening.